Thanks for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell, and a little while ago we had an episode about the Yield Hero contest here in Canada, in which winners from various parts of the country got to go to Commodity Classic in Denver. Also part of that program, several growers from Eastern Canada got to hear from Alex Harrell, a Georgia farmer that won the U.S. soybean yield competition with a record 218 bushel beans, as well as David Hula, a Virginia farmer that won the U.S. corn yield competition with 490 bushel corn. They're great conversations that we thought would be great to share here on the podcast, starting with that top soybean champion, Alex Harrell.
Now, I'd love to kind of walk through kind of your whole season approach to that, just to give, all the growers here in the Yield Hero East webinar series, just to be able to give them kind of an idea of what your thinking's like. Maybe we can kind of start right from the beginning and just give me an idea, like, what is really your overall strategy? What's that thinking that you're doing this time of year, planning for next year?
Yeah, no, everything starts with soil samples. We pull soil samples on 1 acre grids every year. So every field we work gets samples done every year. We do it on 1 acre grids, and we take those samples and we focus on base saturations first. So we've got to balance the soil to start with. So we get those. We know where we want our levels of calcium, hydrogen, potassium, magnesium, and sodium. So we get those balanced. That's our very first step, and then after that, we go into the planter. We want our planter to perform as perfect as it can. We spend a lot of time going through that. And then once we've got our soil balance, we plant it. If we get a good first box we have to check is how good of a stand we've got, whether it's cingulation on beans or emergence on corn. And then after that determines how our management throughout the year goes.
So then when you're talking about, the putting that seed in the planter in the first place, what seed selection look like? What are you looking for? What are some of those traits you need?
The way we do it, for us, we do a lot of on-farm trials. We use university data and third-party data to get our, kind of get our list from. But then we don't really look at their results too much. We just do our own trials on farm. We do variety trials. And, for corn, it's got to stand up here, and it has to have a disease package. We get southern rust really bad, and we get a lot of wind late in the year. So corn has got to stand up for us. That's the big thing on corn. Soybeans, there's a couple other things we look at. Lodging is one of those as well, though. So we don't want corn or soybeans to fall down.
Mm-hmm. Then what about planting date? When you talk about, particularly with soybeans and where early planting, obviously on the calendar is going to be different than what we're doing here in Ontario, but it still probably has that same principle in terms of what early compared to other growers is. How important is it to you?
Planting early on soybeans, they mature off a daytime length. So June 21 is a big day in the soybean world. So whatever's going on June 21, what stage we're at in that plant's life, we can have a pretty good idea of what kind of yield potential we have. Because the longer those days are in reproductive stages, the larger those bean sizes are going to naturally be. So we want to get, and obviously everybody's not going to be mid-grain field June 21st, like a lot of times we are. But the days are a lot longer, 1st of August than they are at 1st September, or 1st of July than they are at 1st of August. So you just kind of, it goes by region, but planting early on the beans is for sure a easy way to pick up bushels.
And then in terms of when you are actually going out, you said, looking after the planters and all of that is a really important part of trying to be successful. Can you talk a little bit about what, things like, on soybeans, what's plant spacing look like? What's row width look like? And, you mentioned cingulation being something that's really, really important to you on beans.
Yep. For soybeans, I don't get hung up on row spacing. I don't get hung up on population. I tell people all the time, whatever planter you have in your barn that will singulate the best is the row spacing you need to be on. Now, obviously, don't go to 4-inch spacing and don't go to 50-inch spacing, but somewhere between 7 and 36-inch rows, I have no problem with, as long as we can singulate them. The singulation is the single biggest factor in plus or minus yield. We don't have time to talk about it, but I did a thing this past year. We went out and we pulled some singulated plants versus some non-singulated plants on the same exact row inches apart, and there was 64% difference in yield. So just by having them singulated.
Yeah, well, that makes a big difference. So, and then fertility is obviously a big part. And you mentioned, and I do see Adam's got a question here in the chat box. But his question is very much related to my next question. His question is really, what's your goal for base saturations on a soil test? And my question leads into what's your fertility goals on a crop?
Yep, base saturation. We want our calcium in the 60 to 70% range. We want our our magnesium in that 13 to 17% range. We want potassium about as high as we can get it. That's typically in that 5 to 8% range, no less than 4. Hydrogen is going to make up the rest of it. As calcium goes up, hydrogen is going to go down. And then sodium will be less than 1%. That's our salt. So the 3 to look at would be calcium 60 to 70, magnesium 13 to 17, and potassium 5 to 8, definitely no lower than 4.
So that's soil sampling. Do you do tissue sampling, Alex?
I do. I tissue sample every Monday during the growing season.
Every Monday.
Until I see a reason, to quit. And the reason we would quit on it is if we've had some big stressors and our yield potential has went from X amount down to here, then we'll just kind of pull the plug and it becomes just a corn crop or a soybean crop, not anything, special. It just comes standard production at that point.
So can you talk a little bit, what are you looking for from those tissue samples and how are you responding?
Yes, like I said, we pull them every Monday. I don't respond off of one individual tissue sample ever. We build a trend line off of all the tissue samples that we've done, and then we watch that trend line, and if we see something go down 2 weeks in a row, we're really monitoring it or we're making an application. Definitely by the 3rd week. So again, like I said, we do them every Monday. We do not respond off of one tissue sample result whatsoever. We have to build that trend line.
Mm-hmm. Maybe talk a little bit about, because, as you've gone through that process and as you've built that, what are some of the things that do surprise you in terms of what that plant needs through the growing season?
Yeah, I used to think we needed to have everything as high as we could get it. And, now I know that is definitely not the case. We want a balanced plant. I would rather have a plant that is balanced with a lot lower values than tissues than one that is not balanced with a lot higher values. So everybody thinks we need those bar graphs as high as they'll go. That's not the case. We just need them balanced.
Then obviously you'll have, the challenge of whether it's pest, whether it's disease. Can you walk through kind of a little bit, maybe talk a little bit, first of all, kind of what are the big ones that you worry about the most, but more important, just because some of those probably aren't as relevant to us, what's your strategy through the growing season for dealing with whatever is trying to go after that plant?
Yeah, we run a pretty strict policy on insects. The earlier we plant, the less insect pressure we have. My beans behind wheat, the double crop beans, we always have heavy insect pressure there. So it's just pretty much automatic sprays on those. Now we're scouting those every week. My consultant, and then we're doing the full season beans the same way, but the worm, the insect pressure, everything on the full season beans are substantially less than the double crop beans that are planted later. And diseases, we're heavy fungicide. If we find the disease in the crop, we have not done our job because we're spraying everything preventative.
Mm-hmm. So then before we kind of get to the harvest and kind of making the plan after that, anything else through the growing season that we've missed? We've talked about, kind of that seed selection, the planting, the fungicide, the, kind of all dealing with all the pressures. What else are you focusing on to really make sure that you get that top yield?
Yep, we're just checking boxes again. Like I said, box number 1 would be the base saturations. Number 2 would be how good is our emergence or our singulation. Box number 3 would be where are our tissue levels on key nutrients at our early stages in that 325 GDU stage. And then after that, it's monitoring all tissue samples. If we see some values go down for 2-3 weeks in a row, we know our yield potential has also went down, and we'll kind of pull back on that and tell people all the time, the hardest thing for me to do is pull back on a crop versus push a crop, because we've done everything right, and then halfway through the year I have to tell myself, okay, this is a 220 bushel corn crop, not a 400 bushel corn crop. We've got to quit spending money on it. And the same thing with soybeans, whether they're 80 bushels or 180 bushels, we've got to know when to pull back, and we also have to read those and know when to push forward based on what we're seeing there. So everything we do out through the year, I mean, we don't just make blanket applications a lot. Everything has a reason, and what products go out are based on tissue samples or things that we're seeing in the field. So start to finish, I can't just sit here and say this is what we do um, all the time every year, because it changes every year, every day, every week. But everything is based on the tissues and what we're seeing in the field and what our yield potential still is.
Mhm.
It's constantly going down, and we're just trying to keep it from going down any more than it has to.
Because what is your yield potential when you're budgeting for 2025? What are you hoping for on corn and beans?
It all depends on the farm, the field, and again, I don't I don't set that number until I see how it comes out of the ground. But I can tell you this: on my corn and soybeans, it's plus or minus $250 per acre, depending on how well our singulation and emergence is. So, that puts our yield potential way up here or down here, and it's all based on how well it comes out of the ground and how evenly we get that crop out of the ground.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit about then you get to harvest and obviously you roll in with the combine? Can you give us kind of an idea in terms of how you manage, kind of the harvest process, bringing in that harvest data, that yield data in, and then using it to manage, which obviously you're trying a whole bunch of different things on a whole bunch of different locations. How are you using that data to manage and be able to make better decisions for the following growing season?
Yeah, we go into harvest. The first thing a lot of people want to talk about is the desiccation. We desiccate all of our beans. When we reach maturity in the pods, I don't care what the plant looks like, how green it is. We go out there, we pull the trigger, and we desiccate those beans and kill them, and then we harvest them at high moisture and dry them down. That's the way we save a lot of header loss, a lot of harvest loss by harvesting them at a higher moisture and then drying them.
Wow. And then when you are then, after you kind of get that, through that process, how do you use that data then that you collect in terms of yield data to know what things were successful, what trials you did were successful and weren't successful?
Yeah, we don't use the harvest data a lot. Yield maps. If we have trials, we actually weigh each individual trial, and there's no, if you do 10 things different to a field, there's no way to know which one works. So we'll actually have trials that break them into each individual application or whatever it is. If there's a product that we're really wanting to learn about, we'll put those trials in. We'll make those applications separate, and we'll weigh that trial where we applied that product versus a check beside it. I don't really go off of yield maps. They're not accurate enough. Now, obviously, they'll pick up a 40 bushel swing, but they're not going to pick up a 4 bushel swing.
When you do finish up the season, how do you gauge success? You talk about you've got a lot of different soil types, you got a lot of different growing conditions, you got a lot of different challenges with each and every farm, just like every grower on this call. Is top yield the only level you mark for success, or what's success look like for you field by field?
No, not at all. I don't look at yield. Again, if I look at a trial, I don't really care. I hate to say I don't care what it yields, because obviously yields what pays everything. But let's say I'm taking a boron product or a zinc product, and I want to know what they're doing. I apply those products. I don't care if they yield more or not, because that may not be our limiting factor. I want to watch tissue samples, and if I apply boron, I want to see my boron levels go up in my tissues. If I apply zinc, I want to see zinc go up. If I apply manganese, I want to see manganese go up. I'm not taking those to harvest, just because unless that's our limiting factor, the yield's not going to go up anyway. Again, it goes back to balance. Now, if boron, zinc, or manganese, one of those three is our limiting factor, when we apply those products and raise them, then yes, yield should absolutely go up. But let's say we apply all three of those products, or apply those products individually, but potassium was our limiting factor the whole time. That was our weakest link. there's no chance that yield's going up because we didn't fix what was limiting anyway. So we don't get hung up on the yield in trials. I want to see that the products that I apply are doing what the products are supposed to do. And again, if that's our limiting factor, then yields will go up if we address it. If it's not our limiting factor, then they're not going to go up. We just want to monitor it to make sure that the product did raise what it was supposed to raise or do what it was supposed to do.
I'm curious though, just kind of overall in terms of strategy. You've talked a lot about paying attention to the details is one of the things that I've kind of taken away. And make sure you're, maintaining that and paying attention and doing all of that on a very regular basis when you talk about tissue sampling and scouting and all and annual soil tests and all that kind of stuff. Is there a secret weapon to all of that, or is it just doing all of it right?
Nope, there's no secret weapon. There's no silver bullet. Tell people all the time, it's like baking a cake. If it takes 18 ingredients to bake this cake, we could probably shave 3 or 4 off of there and still end up with a cake at the end of the day. Doesn't mean it's going to taste good. But when we get everything put in order, everything's balanced, that's when we get the results that we want.
Next up in this episode, we head to Georgia for a conversation with the U.S. corn yield champion, David Hula.
Well, first of all, David, thanks very much for joining the podcast.
Oh, man, it's my pleasure. Anytime I get a chance to talk about corn, I'm going to take advantage of it.
And well, you know what? I've heard you speak several times about it. You're real passionate about it. But for those who haven't heard from you, David, before, let's start from the beginning. Give us a little idea of what the home farm looks like.
Yeah, well, I'm third generation. I got a chance to farm with my late granddad, my late dad. I got a brother that I farmed with, and the fourth generation works with us as well, my son. We farm on the north banks of the James River. Just give you a perspective, we're about 60 miles west of the Atlantic Ocean. We also farm some of the oldest ground here in the U.S. It was first farmed in 1609. When Captain John Smith landed at Jamestown in 1607, they left the island in 1609 and started farming what's called mainland farms. So it is the oldest continuously farmed ground here in the U.S. Unfortunately, I don't own it though, Andrew. Wish I did.
Well, it's pretty cool to have the history behind it and then be able to push what really I see as, kind of that future potential of what all these hybrids can do, to be able for you to kind of be on the leading edge of what is possible. So kind of let's start from the beginning because, being yield champion is not new for you either. This is something you've been able to pull off a lot. Let's start from the beginning. What's it take off the beginning when you're planning over the winter to be able to have, some of this high yielding corn?
Spend a lot of time with looking at data first and foremost, trying to figure out what hybrids work for us. And then, working with the pioneer agronomists, our local guys, as well as some of the regional and national folks to see what do they have coming out there. And, just because we've had success, everybody has that same chance to talk to this, their regional trusted advisor in their seed side. So take advantage of that from a grower's perspective. And in the wintertime, we're spending time trying to put the right product on the right acre. But I spend most of my time working on a planter. If I'm not out talking about corn, I don't care who takes my planter apart, but I'm going to put it back together. And we just pay attention to a lot of details. And once the planter leaves the field, you can't fix that. So if you put the wrong hybrid in it, or if you put the wrong fertility, or if you did something to where the seed's not going to come up uniformly, you're stuck with it. So based on that, that's what you're going to be managing the rest of the growing season.
Because when you do talk about that one chance, and we'll kind of piece apart because you got a lot in there. Let's start with the equipment itself, because you do put a big priority on that planter. What are some of the key things that any grower really needs to focus on when they're looking at their planter?
Well, I mean, you want to make sure your double disc openers are set correctly. And when I say set correctly, you want to make sure that, they're straight, if at all possible, and don't have a wobble in it, because they're going to be warped over time. Missy and Bill Bauer did a lot of work on, the business cards, making sure that touch points are correct, that 1.5 to 2 inches where the business cards, that gap. Then the thing that I walk beside planters, it's easy. Pick up your gauge wheel and let it go. If it drags down slowly, you've got it set properly. If you let it go and then all of a sudden it hits the mustache arm and it gives you a thump, we got some improvement to do. And then one of the easiest things for a grower to do is when they're planting, go behind the planter, make sure the V press wheel, your closing wheel system is centered. Too many times they let that move off center. And probably one of the last things we like to check, make sure those T handles, each row is individual. It doesn't mean that all the T handles are going to be in the same notches, but make sure that each row unit is planting the seed the depth that you want. I have some of my T handles are 3 holes off compared to the neighbor beside it. They're all planting 2.25 inches, but things wear out, and even though it's made by man, doesn't mean it's perfect.
Well, and then the other piece to that you mentioned was fertility. Can you give me an idea what's a fertility program look like, knowing that it's going to evolve a little bit, but how do you make the fertility decision in the first place?
Well, Andrew, we pull 1 acre grid soil samples. We know what kind of fertility we need. Based on that, we focus on our pHs first. I mean, that's the cheapest and easiest fertilizer application you can make, whether you need lime or you don't need lime. Then, based off history of tissue samples, looking at what our crop pulled away, do we need potash? So those are some things that we like to do pre. Then we focus on zinc and phosphorus a little bit from a standpoint of broadcasting. And then I know growers, Andrew, they want to start planting corn and they don't want to stop. So when you start talking about adding fertilizer on the planter, that's like, no way, I'm not going to do that. That's just going to slow me up. But, we're putting nitrogen, phosphorus, zinc, sulfur, boron with the planter. And then we put some fairy dust, snake oils, and nutrition and or PGRs in the trench. So it's a lot going on, but we want to make sure we get it done right.
Well, it goes back to what you said before. Like you only get one chance to do this, so you really better make sure you take full advantage. Let's say, okay, you get that in, you've got your one chance, seeds in the ground, fertility's there with what you wanted. What's next? Now, how are you going to make decisions in season to look after that?
Yeah, well, after we get the corn planted, then it's up to the grower to go evaluate what kind of stand he has. Now, we can go back 2-3 weeks after and say, hey, we dropped 32,000 and we got a 31,000 stand, and we feel like we've checked the box. Well, we haven't checked the box, because I want to be out there when the crop's actually emerging. I want to see, is all the corn coming up uniformly? And I know, there's folks in the audience that have probably done those flagging trials where you go out there and you put a flag out on the plants that you see come up where the spikeless out, and then you go back 12 hours later and put a different color flag. If you haven't ever done that, Precision Planting has a great tool for that, illustration to talk about that. So growers need to do that. So that's the next thing, because in order to have a 300 or 350 on or better bushel crop potential, you have to have a 300 or 350 bushel stand. If we don't have that stand, it doesn't matter what we throw at it. You're not going to pick up any more bushels.
Because you mentioned yield numbers like this, and I've heard you comment on this before. This isn't some magical piece of dirt you have behind the shop, or that first farm that was landed, in the U.S. here. This is your program you do across most of your acres. Yeah,
when the planter leaves the field, outside of changing hybrids and or population, the fertility is the same. Everything, our starter, it goes on every acre. Our in furrow goes on every acre. Now, we might tweak some things in furrow because we might have put out some chicken litter and we feel like we need more zinc. So that goes on all acres. Then we start adjusting and evaluate the stand. And if the stand's good from a standpoint of uniform emergence, then we feel like we've checked the box. And Andrew, you hit a key thing. Everybody thinks we got a magic piece of dirt. we've had success on 5 different center pivots, and 3 of them here at the home farm and 2 at the western farm, 2 different counties, 28 miles apart, almost 30 miles apart when you go down the farm lane. And it's just a system. It's a program that we've incorporated. So we don't have that one magic piece of dirt. I wish we did, but no, we've been able to do it on several different farms and in essence 2 different counties as well.
Now, as you're going, you kind of determine the populations there, that stand counts there. Now you're going to kind of go full on with a crop. Do you do tissue sampling? We were talking to Alex, and he does tissue sampling. Do you do it, and how do you incorporate it?
Yeah. So when I think about checking the boxes, we do the planter, we fix our pH, we plant the seed, then we evaluate the stand, and then the next box we check is we pull a tissue sample that 325 to 350 GDU mark. And based on what some of those nutrition levels are, that's telling me if that crop is something we're going to continue to push or it's just regular corn. Now, Andrew, that's hard to believe. A corn that's just now at V3, we can determine if it's something that's going to be 350, 400 on up bushel yield potential. And if it doesn't have the levels that we want, then that field just became regular corn. Now, that regular corn might be 275 or 325 bushel or somewhere in that range, but it's just not going to be that yield that we've been trying to covet.
Well, you definitely work with different normal corn numbers than I do, David, but I can appreciate that similarity in the fact that knowing what the yield potential is such a critical fact to how you're actually going to feed it, knowing what that spread could be. Big conversation up here is biologicals, if they play a role. What do you think about biologicals? Where do you think they're going?
Yeah, well, us being part of Total Acre, the group across the country, we see a lot. We're exposed, and I'm exposed to a lot of biologicals. But I still go about it, and I'd like to do this analogy. If your wife has a dog, and you were to take that dog to South Africa and let it go in a safari, how long do you think it's going to live? Probably not very long. It's going to become a dog nugget at some point in time, pretty quick. So when people start introducing new biology into your soil environment, how long is it going to last? Because, things want to go back to their natural state. Now, there's some companies, they talk about these biologicals, you put them out there, they do what they want for that season, but then they're not going to survive the winter, or they're not going to survive till next season because they're not natural. We like to feed what's in their soil environment. We talk about bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. There's a whole bunch of biology in the soil. So let's try to get it balanced. And what is balance? So understanding and I'm about, let's take a sample. Let's see where we are. Find a trusted advisor that you have a relationship to where you can send these samples off to. And then maybe there are some biological products you can put in, but I'm all about feeding what we have first and foremost and make that work. And so there is a play. I'm excited about what the future has to bring, because now we're seeing, naturally biological probiotics and that can be introduced into the system as well as sprayed on foliar. But I'm cautiously optimistic, Andrew.
Well, that's fair enough. Then the last part of the program I want to touch on is, pests and disease, particularly disease, just given that, that's kind of the one that, you deal with pretty regularly, at least up here. What's your, kind of pest and disease program look like? How do you determine whether it's a spray or no spray situation?
Well, when you say disease, first thing that comes to my mind here, we're getting 1.5 inches of rain today. We just had 2.5 inches Monday. We're cool. And I'm thinking of guys, I have neighbors that have corn planted, and it's about 2.5, 3 leaf stage. We had a freeze on Monday, so we know that corn took a beating on it. But if I had corn in the ground, I'd already know I have to replant because we get pythium or dampen off. And this is the perfect environment for that. Outside of that, once we get the crop off to a good start, disease-wise, gray leaf spot, southern rust are problems. We fortunately or blessed in their environment, tar spot has not been an issue for us. The blights clearly can be a problem, northern and southern blights, and then just regular common rust. They would be the ones that I would focus on, and fungicides take care of those quite well. Other things that pests from a standpoint of insects, bill bug's an issue. So we do a lot of Poncho 1250 over treatment of corn. And then later season, stink bugs. I don't think people understand or focus on stink bugs as much as they should. Stink bugs can be a problem. We get the occasional Japanese beetles, but then corn earworms probably our biggest killer from finishing that crop to where they're allowing disease to get into the ear because they're punching holes and eating some kernels. And one thing that we've noticed, Andrew, if we get corn earworms, the blackbirds find the worm. And then once they get in the ear, they say, oh my goodness, we got a buffet here. So now they found corn. So we got to keep the corn earworms out just to keep the blackbirds out.
Yeah, it sounds like, just when you think you might have one problem solved, it comes up with another one. So, and you know what, having heard you before, spoken to you before, I know the answer to this question already, David. I'm always looking for what's that one secret thing that makes everything go perfectly. But David, I already know that so much of it has to do with the process, not that one fix.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to have that one silver bullet that everybody wants that you could put in your spray inductor and all of a sudden give you these extra bushels. After I've been thinking about it for over time, Andrew, there are silver bullets, but everybody's silver bullet changes. I remember probably 15 years ago, we were stuck at a yield barrier and we were in that 330, 340 bushel range. Great location to be stuck at. There's nothing wrong with that. But I had a trusted advisor come by, Philip Davis, and he said, hey, why don't we put some micronutrients on at V3? We did that. And then all of a sudden we picked up 27 to 32 bushels from that one thing. So that was a yield limiting factor. Well, we've incorporated that. Now we have another yield limiting factor. So we just have to keep finding out what they are. And once you figure it out, that is a silver bullet. But I'll leave you with this one thing, though, Andrew. There's only 3 things to get high yield in corn. Good Lord's got to bless you. That's number 1. Number 2, you got to use Pioneer seed, without a doubt. And then number 3, you got to have John Deere paint. So if you're not using those, I can help pray for you. But that's what you need, Andrew.
Well, I certainly can take a lesson from the last 2 of those. Definitely, it feels like. But gosh, when you talk about those numbers, I know I got some work to do, but it definitely is great to talk to you, David. Get some inspiration to make sure as we go into the 2025 growing season, I aim higher and aim for bushels like you. David, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you, Andrew.
What a couple of great conversations. I certainly hope you enjoyed them and got something out of them. If you have missed any of our previous episodes, like that one I mentioned off the top with the 2 Yield Hero champions from Canada, you can check our podcast feed, which has all of our past episodes. They are also on the Corteva Canada YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to both the YouTube channel and the podcast feed on your favorite podcast app, and that way you never miss an episode. If you'd like to stay in touch, you can always follow Pioneer Seeds on X at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA, or find me, Fresh Air Farmer. And remember, if you're ever looking for more information or advice, just ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.